Welcome to Creation to Restoration, the podcast that explores behind the scenes of the biblical timeline. With your hosts, Randall Owens and Andy Patt.
Good morning, Andy.
Morning, Randall. How you doing today?
We're doing really, really good. Today, we're going to get into some fun stuff. We're going to be talking about the Tower of Babel and what went crazy there and what happened to all the people and what did they do so wrong and why was God so upset with it. So that's, and, you know, we're going to go down some rabbit holes with, I believe, the pyramids. And that's going to be fun.
Yeah, that kind of came up in our conversation before the conversation, if you will, and it's like, oh, there's an interesting thought.
Let's go down that road for a minute. All right, so let's back up. Let's start with Genesis 9:1 and look at what happened. Again, this is after the flood and what God says to Noah. And Genesis 9:1 says, "And God blessed Noah and his sons and said to them, 'Be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth.'" Now, if that sounds familiar to you, it should, because that's the same thing he said to Adam and Eve.
Absolutely.
So we see this mandate is to multiply, to fill the earth. So God's glory and his way of doing things will just fill the entire earth, will cover the earth. But do you think Noah's descendants listened and wanted to do that? Well,
about as well as Adam's.
That's right. Let's look and see what happened. This is, again, let's pick it up now, jumping over to Genesis 11. And let's read the first 4 verses there. And here we go. It says, "Now the whole earth had one language and the same words. And as the people migrated from the east, they found a plain in the land of Shinar and settled there. And they said to one another, 'Come, let us make bricks and burn them thoroughly.' And they had brick for stone and bitumen for mortar. And they said, 'Come, let us build for ourselves a city and a tower with its top in the heavens. And let us make a name for ourselves, lest we be dispersed over the face of the whole earth.'" Now, there's a whole lot in those first 4 verses, and I say that the verse 4 is really where it goes completely kind of off the rails. And so then they said, in verse 4, "Then they said, 'Come, let us build ourselves a city and a tower with its top in the heavens, and let us make there a name for ourselves, lest we be dispersed over the face of the whole earth.'" And if I'm not mistaken, what had God already told them?
Go multiply, fill the earth.
Disperse yourselves over the face of the
right.
earth. And now they're like, "Oh, we're going to stop right here and do this thing." So I don't know. Wise men always want to rebel. That seems to be what's in our very nature.
Well, and that's kind of what the lineage before this told us. It mentioned at one point, oh, and here's where the rebellion started. So, yeah,
right.
You'd be anticipating that we're about to hear about this rebellion when you get to the next chapter.
Mm-hmm.
So,
yeah. So again, they multiplied, that's for sure, but they did not disperse themselves over the face of the whole earth. Again, that was what they were trying to prevent. They all wanted to clump up together, and so they want to make a name for themselves. So they start building this tower. Now, a lot of people get taught, they built this tower so they could get up to heaven. But honestly, it was the opposite of that. They were building a tower. And we talked about Eden before, that it was, kind of Eden just as much a physical place as a spiritual place. And this whole idea of a temple, and it's spiritual because God's dwelling there, again, walking in the garden with Adam and Eve. And so this idea that mankind understood that these mountaintop garden temples, again, Eden's described as the mountain of God, not just a garden. So this mountain garden idea, these mountaintop temples. And so what the people at Babel are trying to do here, they build this building, this tower, again, in the ancient world called a ziggurat.
Right.
And so the idea was that they put this temple on top, and they were trying to get the little g gods to come down.
Yeah.
So they could do that.
And I think that's, depending on how you want to look at it, understand it, it's hard in English to get exactly what they're trying to say there. But, in the translation you read, "whose top is in the heavens," you look at some others, it says, "whose top may reach unto heaven." The idea is that from the top, they're going to reach out to heaven, not that they're going to get there. So I think that's the idea of the tower in the clouds, as opposed to, hey, we're going to build this a tower, and then from the top of that tower, we're going to reach out to heaven.
Yes.
And that's them communicating with and inviting the gods back down, trying to invite the same thing that brought the destruction of the flood in the first place.
Right. It was just, again, I know this sounds crazy, but this is exactly what they attempt to do.
Right.
So when you think, well, why is God so upset that they built a tall building? Well, it's what they were trying to do with it.
Yeah.
They were creating at the top of it a temple so they could reach out to the gods and entice them to come down, and so they could continue with this this crazy thing. Again, we talked about before the flood what was going on, and again, this supernatural stuff was happening with the Watchers and the Nephilim and all these things. And so here goes mankind again, trying to chase after these things, and so it doesn't take mankind long to just kind of, go completely off the rails. So Genesis 11, 7 through 9. Let's see what happens. It says. This is God. It says, "Come, now let us go down there and confuse their language, so that they may not understand one another's speech." So the Lord dispersed them from there over the face of all the earth, and they left off building the city. Therefore its name was called Babel, because there the Lord confused the language of all the earth, and from there the Lord dispersed them over the face of all the earth. Well, there you go. I mean, God is going to accomplish what he wanted them to do, regardless of whether or not they want to cooperate and do it themselves.
Yeah.
So again, that should be a lesson for us today. It's no different later than what happens to Jonah. Go to Nineveh and preach, God says. Jonah says, nope, I'm going to go the opposite direction. God says, we'll see about that.
Right. Yeah.
So understanding when God's given us something to do, it's always in our best interest to move forward in that. I know it may not be fun, it may not be comfortable, it may not be something we want to do, but that is always, at the end of the day, what's going to be best for us.
Yeah, absolutely. And if not only for the promise of the reward for being diligent, being faithful in the walk and the journey that he sets you on, but if you really wanted to be selfish about it, there's a lot of discomfort that comes with disobedience. So not only are you missing out on the reward for the faithful, but you're also inviting hardship. As opposed to God's promise. If you just follow with what he said, do what he led you to do, be obedient with the calling that you're given, he's going to take care of all the basic stuff. You're not going to be necessarily rich and famous, but your needs will be met, and you'll have a peace that surpasses understanding. And what more can you really, really want? I mean, to have a purpose in life, to have a peace in life, and to not need for anything.
Right, and that is what, in the Word of God, we find that's what God calls success and prosperity.
Right. Exactly.
If you want to have success and be prosperous, this is what he said. Obedience is the key to doing that.
Exactly.
Right. And so it doesn't look like we always want to make, prosperity this other thing, and it's always about money, and it's always about fame. It's not about any of those things. Not according to God. Again, if we're doing what he's called us to do, then therein lies the success. So it seems like that this will maybe end up being our shortest podcast ever, because we've totally done everything we need to talk about for the Tower of Babel. There it is, wrapped up in a nice little package, or at least you'd think so if you listen to the Sunday school lessons about it.
Right, exactly. Right?
But maybe there's a little bit more to the story. So let's dig a little deeper. So again, everybody's gathered into one place after God tells them disperse, and they say, no, we don't want to do that. Let's build his tower. Let's do this. And then God disperses them and confuses their languages, right? Mm-hmm. So in effect, this is what's been termed in some scholarly circles as when God disinherited mankind from his family at this one point for a brief period. He sends them off and says, okay, let's do this. Now, this comes from what's known as a Deuteronomy 32 worldview. And so I'm going to read this now. Let's look at Deuteronomy. It's verses 7, 8, and 9. Let's look at what happens. It says, and remember the days of old. Consider the years of many generations. Ask your father, and he will show you. Your elders, and they will tell you. When the Most High gave to the nations their inheritance, when he divided mankind, he fixed the borders of the peoples according to the number of the sons of God. But the Lord's portion is his people, Jacob, his allotted heritage. And this is talking about, when did God divide the nations? When did he divide mankind? Well, at the Tower of Babel scenario. That's and so talk a little bit about, if you will, we see back earlier in Genesis, it talks about the nations.
Yeah, well, and so we did the table of nations, chapter 10, when we were talking about the sons of Noah. And so you go through they begat, but they begat, they, and you get this general set of lineages. It's like, okay, well, now was that all their kids? No, I mean, if they were building a big old city, they had a bunch going on, and that was in the middle of all that. Mm-hmm. But I think what's critical is to understand that the very last verse of chapter 10, which is like setting up chapter 11, you get through all the names, and he goes through 70, and he says, these are the families of the sons of Noah after their generations in their nations. So if we're talking before the Tower of Babel incident, they're not in nations because, again, they're now congregating and building their city, right?
That's right.
So this is speaking to something that happens, and he says, and by these were the nations divided in the earth after the flood. So 10 is almost kind of like a parenthesis in the story, because you get off the boat, and then it's like, okay, and so here's what the lineages are going to look like. And by the way, all the different nations that we see, this is the division of the nations by these particular sons, these 70. And then you fast forward to Babel and you realize how they were divided.
Right.
So this is that. And then Deuteronomy gives some additional context because we're looking at the physical side here, and then that helps introduce the spiritual side of that.
Right.
Yeah.
So we look at the spiritual side. So again, Deuteronomy 32, let's look at verse 8. It says, when the Most High gave to the nations their inheritance, when he divided mankind, he fixed the borders of the peoples according to the number of the sons of God. So here we go. Now we're looking at these sons of God, these characters, these spiritual beings, these other Elohim, the little g gods that God has apparently put over. And you know, by the way, these are the same ones when we look at Psalm 89. We're going to see them show up, and Psalm 82, when we talk about the sons of God who are being judged. What are they being judged for? It's in the divine council scene. That we see this happening. And said again, so if he fixed the borders of the people after the flood according to the number of the sons of God, so he's put these sons of God over them. Basically, the Tower of Babel, they're trying to get the little g gods to come down so they can worship them, so they can interact with them. And God, Yahweh is in effect saying, okay, here you go. Like I will sometimes say to people, he's saying, all right, if that's what you want, that's what you can have. This is what I'm going to do. I'm going to put them over you. So they're going to be, kind of overseeing things. And then we see later that these little g gods have completely wanted to start receiving worship themselves.
Right.
They're not ruling over, and they're not directing mankind in their nation states the way that Yahweh, the way that the Lord Most High wanted them to. And so these little g gods are being judged for what they have done in receiving worship and letting things go off the rails. It talks about, again, things like they were not taking care of the people who needed it the most. And bribery was in all the wickedness that was being rewarded. And so we see, again, that's the judgment over that. But this is the setup for it. Again, when the Most High gave to the nations their inheritance, when he divided mankind, he fixed the borders of the peoples according to the number of the sons of God. That is the setup.
Right.
And that's all happening. Again, this is in Deuteronomy 32, and that was verse 8.
Well, and you get a little bit of insight into how all that's playing out, too, because there's an element of, Satan's dominion on the earth until Christ comes back and takes it, right? Mm-hmm. And so when you talk about the sons of God, they fall on both sides of wicked and holy.
Right.
The ones that still follow Yahweh, the ones that don't.
Mm-hmm.
And you get a sense of the territorial nature of it, but B, the conflict that we don't witness when you look at things like in Daniel. There's that angel that comes to Daniel after he starts fasting, right? Mm-hmm. And when he says, he goes, from the first you set your heart to understand, to chase yourself for God, I came for your words. He goes, but the prince of the kingdom of Persia withstood me, 1 in 20 days. Mm-hmm. Wait, so you're talking about like a guy in a kingdom, he saw the angel coming and goes, you shall not pass. No, that's not what happened. And then he gets to the end of the talking to him and he's like, and now I will return to fight with the prince of Persia. And when I am gone forth, lo, the prince of Grecia shall come. Mm-hmm. I mean, in terms of human kingdoms, Grecia wasn't on the map yet.
Right.
But they're already, the boundaries that were set for the principalities over these kingdoms of the earth, they're already in conflict to bring about whatever the next plan is. There's something happening on the spiritual end before we even see it manifest in the physical necessarily. And so, yeah, these the way these nations and kingdoms are divided, God set them out, laid their boundaries. The sons of God have their territories, and we see they're squabbling, they're fighting, they're not doing what they're supposed to be doing. So,
exactly.
Yeah.
Again, it's a crazy, entrance into free will, right?
Yeah.
They're allowed to do, again, God's given them orders and said, this is what I want you to do, but they go off the rails. Again, much like mankind, that's what we do. So let's back up from it. Let's get back to Babel for a second here.
Yeah.
And let's talk about, so when the people at Babel tried to get these little g gods to come down and worship them, they built a tower, right? Now, that tower they built, what in the ancient times was called a ziggurat.
Right.
And so what was a ziggurat? It's kind of it's kind of a pyramid shape, except it's a stepped
Right.
shape. The way again, it goes up and then it comes over a little bit and it goes up and it comes over a little bit. And so you see that. And the ziggurats were built with temples on top. And that was just kind of the way it was. Again, back in a mountaintop temple garden, that's what these lush gardens on top. That was a temple that was, again, attempting to entice the gods down, because that's what they did. So these ziggurats were a really, really big deal in the ancient world. So it's no wonder then when God divides mankind up, we see these ziggurat style shape structures all over the world.
Mm-hmm.
There are literally thousands of them.
Right.
And they're found in Egypt, in China, in Mexico. I mean, literally, they're all over the globe. So like the flood story, right? Every culture has a flood story. Well, it's because there was the truth of the actual flood that happened. There was also the truth that the actual Tower of Babel happened. And then the peoples across the world, when they're scattered, they take that knowledge and information with them. And so we see it everywhere. It's not a coincidence.
Right. Well, and so there's an interesting element to that, because, again, what were they trying to do? They were trying to invite back the old ways.
Right.
And so
right.
their fathers, the sons of Noah, would have been able to tell the stories. Oh man, you should have seen what happened before the flood. Because no, they're starting off as the only ones, right?
Mm-hmm.
More kids are born, might be here. Mm-hmm. And then, of course, you start to have some ears open to influence, and then they hear about these things, and they start to envy the power and that kind of stuff that their forefathers had. And so they set about, in pride and in chasing after making a name for themselves, they want to reestablish their own greatness. Well, when God divides them, he could just, like a piece on a board, pick you up, move you over here. Mm-hmm. But how does he achieve it? He goes by dividing by their languages. So there was Babel, there was confusion. They no longer could communicate. Mm-hmm. And the question is, why is that also important? I mean, does it create a barrier maybe to stop them from going back? Possibly. But when you look at, kind of the art of war, know thy enemy being one of those key things, you look at what they say about their heritage and their history is that, the God they war against was angry with their schemes and what does the Bible say? That they might accomplish everything they set their heart to do.
Right.
And so if they were trying to bring about the pre-flood world, they could have. And the language was critical, because there's an element of that occult, that unity of the rituals and the sacrifices and everything that they do to make that happen, where each family, according to their tradition, was entrusted with a piece of that secret knowledge. And so in the division, in the inability to communicate, they could no longer accomplish the rituals, and they could no longer do it. 'Cause something about them changing their languages and not being able to communicate prevented them from accomplishing what they wanted done. And so God knows this, and he separated them up. And so you do find a lot of these cultures that build these, there's elements of that occult practice that carries forth to all of them. There's some commonalities, but then there's some differences. And none of them are able to actually do what the Babel ziggurat was said to have been able to do. Mm-hmm. And so there's that interesting correlation. So you look at Chichen Itza and the stuff that they do there. It's always about sacrifice. It's always about something. It's always about something grotesque. Mm-hmm. And they claim an amount of power because of whatever son of God that's over their region.
Right.
But they can no longer bring it all together.
Mm-hmm. So again, it becomes really, really clear. And we talk about, again, we wrestle not against flesh and blood, but against principalities, against powers, against the rulers of the darkness of this world, against spiritual wickedness in heavenly places. Mm-hmm. We see these principalities and these powers put over geographical regions. And so it's okay. There is something absolutely to the idea of, spiritual battles over physical places.
Right.
And so that's a topic we're going to get into at some point as we talk about, spiritual turf wars and what, really what's going on there. Why does it matter? But it does matter. Seemingly it matters. If God had a promised land for Israel, there was a piece of dirt he wanted to be claimed by his people. So again, a different story for a different day.
Right.
But the idea of ziggurat and the power and the sacrifices, and this was supposed to be a temple. We've known that even in our own history, to see that, to look back, and again, the Mayans and all this kind of stuff, these ziggurat-shaped towers that people do. But now let's talk for a second here about something that looks kind of like a ziggurat, but not exactly a ziggurat. It's the same shape, a pyramid. And talk to us for a minute, Andy, about the most famous pyramids.
Yeah, so I think a lot of us, we think of pyramids, everyone's first thought goes to the pyramids of Giza, the Great Pyramid of Giza specifically, right?
Yep.
And so I think a normal perspective of someone who's just looking across the world and going, oh, look at all these cultures that build pyramids, would lump them all together. However, people who are really into the Giza pyramids, specifically the Great Pyramid, are keen to point out that there's something categorically different about that one than all the rest. And one of the concepts that I've tried, a lens, if you will, that I put over the scriptures and over history to try to understand what things are going on, is the idea that, again, God created everything. Satan created nothing. He wants to call himself God and be like God. And so all he can do is make forgeries. He counterfeits and he corrupts. And so the ziggurats have that same general shape, the square base and the sides, and but then there's a temple at the top in which they do profane things. The Great Pyramid has no temple at the top. It's just a pyramid all the way to a point. There's also no tomb. There's no writing. There's no hieroglyphics. There's nothing in that to signify that it was meant for anything like what they talk about the pyramids were, quote unquote, for. Like, oh, they're burials or that. The Great Pyramid is not that. And then you get into the math, of course, like the ratios between the height and the base and the circumference of the earth and distance to the moon, the distance to the sun, like all the math of like the universe you can basically pull out of the pyramid. So A, what the heck is that? That's kind of cool. But B, yeah, it doesn't have any purpose that is discernible. So why is it there? There's something interesting about in the history of Egypt, there being, not the borders that we know today, but when Egypt was basically focused around the Nile, in
right.
ancient Egypt.
Egypt, right.
Yeah, you've got an idea that there's the nation of Egypt, but then there's been the times where they've been at war. So there's like North Egypt and South Egypt. There's a passage you get to when God's prophesying about Egypt in Isaiah. And he mentions that there's something interesting there, which would be in verse 19, Isaiah 19:19, he says, and in that day there shall be an altar to the Lord. So this is an altar to God in the midst of the land of Egypt, and a pillar at the border thereof to the Lord. So it's talking about this thing which is like an altar and a pillar to the Lord that is both in the midst of and at the border of Egypt. Well, the Giza Plateau was the border between north and south, and it's kind of right there in the middle of Egypt. It's conjecture to an extent, but it's a really curious idea because according to their own history, the Great Pyramids pre-existed them. And there's other stories I've heard about some of the when they were more agriculture, before the Egyptian culture that we know had risen up. So they talked about the ancient men of old who would come and essentially built these big things and taught them things and gave them language and taught them about their God and left that there. Well, okay, that's Ancient Aliens is going to run with that and talk about like these, the ancient sky gods that came down. But
right.
There's something else about the Bible and the history that it gives that lends some credence to that. So when you talk about the sons of Noah, we mentioned last week, Shem was the one through which the knowledge of God persisted, right?
Right.
But it wasn't his whole lineage. It was, I believe, Shem and a small group that actually carried that on, and may very well be the one ancient that you see showing up in cultures trying to spread the word of their God around. Did he potentially build this pillar and this altar in the midst of Egypt for a time that God's going to harken back to that for some prophecy, for some event that's going to take place there? You've got the inner workings of it when you get in. You've got the king's chamber, and you've got the big pit below, and there's the broad path that leads to the pit, and the narrow way that heads up to the king's chamber. Like, it just seems like there's a lot of potential symbolism there that's been preserved, and some knowledge of the universe, knowledge of the gospel. It fits it's a potential narrative around the pyramid, which I think might fit something purposeful for our God, as opposed to all of the counterfeits that are designed to focus and purpose for that kingdom.
Right. The Great Pyramid versus the smaller ziggurats and the other things that are happening around the world.
Yeah.
So that's a very interesting thought about that.
Yeah. Well, as far as the Shem thing goes, there was a point in time which I calculated the way that one might refer to him. And this is Isaac. So, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob. Isaac would have been the first person in the lineage of Shem to outlive him.
Okay.
And so he would have known Shem had they met. And if he would have said to his buddy, "Hey, yeah, so guess who's coming over tomorrow?" No, it's Shem. Who's Shem? Well, he's my great 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 granddad. Like,
Okay.
so many generations. Like, we don't consider that. And so when they're talking about we talk about the global phenomenon of ancestor worship. I mean, and you look at Genesis 47. Jacob said unto Pharaoh, "The days and the years of my pilgrimage are 130 years. Few and evil have my days been, and have not attained unto the days of the years of my fathers in the days of their pilgrimage." I mean, Shem was that father after the flood of theirs. And it talks about his pilgrimage and how much turmoil and how long his whole journey was. He would have known him. He could have met him. So like, this is not just a story. This is like,
these are things that we can't wrap our heads around because, again, we're 80, 85 years, somewhere in that nature is normal for a man. And so the idea that people are living 800-900 years, and they see how many generations of great and great grandfather and great 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 and great 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 grandfather that could still talk to them and tell them the stories and explain things to them.
Yeah, firsthand accounts.
Exactly.
Of the flood and the world before the flood, at the point where the Jews are going into captivity in Egypt.
Yes.
Yes. I mean, whole civilizations and all this stuff coming on, and that can be carried on. So the idea of the reliability of transition of old peoples and nomadic peoples and word of mouth folk tales. I mean, we still got eyewitnesses, man.
Exactly. This isn't just a tradition. This is eyewitness. So I want to mention one other thing before we wrap it up today, because we're real close to the end here. Because I was asked this question not too long ago, because I was talking to somebody about the Tower of Babel, and when God dispersed the people across the earth, they didn't want to get dispersed, and God said, I'm going to confuse their language and disperse them across the earth according to the number of the sons of God in all these different areas of the earth. And the question that was asked was, well, how did he do that? Did he just say go and then they just had to walk there? And it's like, no, it's like, so here's what I believe. I believe it's exactly like what happened to Philip. After he baptized the eunuch. Now, if you go to Acts, it's chapter 8. You get to Acts chapter 8, and you've got the story of this eunuch who's reading the scroll of Isaiah, and then now there's Philip. The Spirit has told Philip, go catch up with him and explain this to him. And so Philip does, and now the eunuch's like, hey, there's some water. Well, look here. It says in verse 38, and he commanded the chariot to stop, and they both went down into the water, Philip and the eunuch, and he baptized him. And when they came up out of the water, the Spirit of the Lord carried Philip away, and the eunuch saw him no more, and he went on his way rejoicing. But Philip found himself at Azotus, and as he passed throughout, he preached the gospel to all the towns until he came to Caesarea. Again, so it would not be unheard of or uncommon for all of a sudden you to wake up and find yourself in a whole different geographical location if God wanted you to be there. And I just think it's an interesting thought about, that's not a big deal for God. It's just like, if God says go get after it, get out of the face of the earth, and you don't go, he could put you there.
You could.
No harder than for him to send a great fish to bring Jonah back than it is to just put you where he wants you, right? So an interesting thought. How did they get there? Let's we're going to stop and wrap it up for right there for today. But a lot of fascinating stuff. People go do some research on the pyramids.
Yeah, no, that'll be a rabbit hole you'll be stuck in for a while. So that's a neat one.
That's fun stuff. Yeah. All right. Thanks for coming and hanging out, Andy.
Yes, sir. Thanks for having me.